She was supposed to be just another name on the civilian contractor roster. That was how Director Warren Goss saw her, anyway. A warm body filling a shift, interchangeable with the dozen other contract nurses, cycling through Brooke Army Medical Center on any given Tuesday. He had never looked twice at Faye Ryker. Most people didn't. That was entirely by design. The trauma wing of Brooke ran on controlled chaos. San Antonio in July was brutal, and the operations at Fort Sam Houston kept the emergency bays busy around the clock. Training accidents, vehicle rollovers, the occasional catastrophic equipment failure. Faye had been working these floors for 3 years. She knew the rhythm of the place, the way a musician knows a piece of music. The exact pitch of the alarms that meant things were merely bad versus the ones that meant things were catastrophic. She knew which orderlies cut corners on equipment checks, which surgeons went quiet under pressure, and which ones needed to hear a calm voice in their ear to stop their hands from shaking. She never announced any of this. She just worked. On the morning it happened, the radio crackle started at 0647. Faye was already at the supply station when the overhead paging system blew open. Multi-vehicle collision on Highway 90. 3 military transport vehicles. Possible IED remnants. 14 casualties inbound. ETA 11 minutes. The trauma bay became a different kind of machine. Gurneys scraped across linoleum. IV kits clattered onto steel trays. Faye moved through it all without a word, positioning herself at Bay 3, the one with the best sightline to the incoming doors, and running a silent mental checklist. Airway kit, decompression needles, 2 large bore IVs already cracked open, blood type O-neg standing by. The doors blew in. The first gurney carried a kid who couldn't have been older than 22. His ACUs were shredded at the left side. The paramedic calling out the stats sounded steady, but Faye caught the slight tremor in his voice. Penetrating chest trauma, left hemothorax, O-sat at 82 and falling, pressure 60 over palp. Dr. Sam Wilder, the military trauma physician, assigned to Bay 3, stepped forward and immediately stalled. He was brilliant. Faye knew that. The kind of doctor who had aced every simulation, every written board, every clinical test. What he hadn't yet learned was what to do when the simulation looked up at you with actual terrified eyes and an actual failing heart. Faye stepped to the opposite side of the gurney before Wilder could spiral. "Left tension pneumo, Dr. Wilder," she said quietly. "We need a needle decompression now. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. I'll prep the site." Wilder blinked. His training clicked back in. "Right, yes. Get me a 14 gauge. She already had it in her hand. While Wilder worked the needle in, Faye maintained steady pressure on a secondary laceration at the patient's side, monitoring the monitor without looking away from Wilder's hands, reading the situation the way a pilot reads instruments, peripheral, constant, and without panic. "Good," she murmured when the air released with that characteristic hiss. "His pressure's climbing. Watch the trachea. Still midline?" "Midline," confirmed the respiratory tech. "Then we're ahead of it." She adjusted the blood flow on the IV, checked the drip rate, and caught the patient's hand for 1/2 second. "You're okay," she told him. "We have you." She had said those exact words in very different places, places that smelled nothing like antiseptic. The bay was still churning through its second and third patients when the double doors at the far end of the corridor opened with a different kind of authority. Not the urgent, purposeful swing of paramedics. Not the measured stride of an on-call surgeon. This was slower, deliberate. the walk of a man who wanted to be noticed arriving. Director Warren Goss was 6'2", barrel-chested, and wore his uniform the way other men wore expensive suits, as a declaration of status. His chest bore the neat rows of ribbons that come from a career spent in logistics, procurement, and administrative postings. He had been at Brooke for 6 weeks, transferred in from a desk role at the Pentagon with the title of Chief of Medical Operations. And in those 6 weeks, he had succeeded in alienating most of the trauma staff, restructuring the shift rotation twice, and introducing a 17-page protocol addendum that no one in active care had time to read. He surveyed the trauma bay the way a man surveys a subordinate's messy desk. "What is the condition of this floor?" Goss said loudly, cutting through the ambient noise of the monitors. Wilder looked up, sweating. "Sir, we have multiple criticals." "I can see that. What I'm asking is why a civilian contract employee is running a primary line on a military patient." Goss's eyes had locked onto Faye. She didn't look up. She was adjusting the chest tube drainage, watching the output color. "Step away from the patient." "She's assisting," Wilder said carefully. "Assisting." Goss repeated the word like it had an unpleasant flavor. According to Protocol 7, subsection C, civilian contractors are restricted to secondary support roles in active military casualty management. Captain Harrow can take primary. He gestured at a young military nurse who had just entered the bay and clearly had no idea what she was stepping into. "Captain Harrow hasn't been certified for hemithorax management at this acuity," Faye said. Still calm, still not looking up. Goss turned slowly the way a gun turret turns. "Excuse me." Now she looked up. Her eyes were gray, the flat, even gray of a winter sky, the kind that gave nothing away. "Captain Harrow completed her trauma cert 8 months ago. It doesn't cover pleural decompression or chest tube management at this level. If you pull me from this patient right now, his output tips back into crisis within 90 seconds, and you will have a preventable death in Bay 3. She held his gaze. "Sir." The "sir" landed like a period at the end of a sentence nobody wanted to finish. Goss stepped deeper into the bay. The staff around him subtly shifted, a half step back, the instinctive flinch of people who have learned to make themselves small when authority decides to make a point. "You are a civilian contractor at a United States Army medical facility," he said quietly, in the voice men like him reserved for moments when they wanted the threat to feel private. "You work here because we allow you to work here. You follow my protocols or you don't work here at all. Are we clear?" Faye glanced at the monitor, numbers still holding. "We're clear," she said. "When this patient is stable, I'll be happy to discuss protocol. Until then, I'm staying at this table." She had seen that particular look on a man's face before, the look that comes just before something breaks. Goss's jaw worked silently for a moment. Around them, the monitors beeped. The fluids dripped, and the entire bay seemed to hold its breath. Then Wilder's voice cut through. His OSAT is back to 96, pressure stabilizing. "I think we have him." The words moved through the room like the first exhale after a very long submersion. Goss did not help. He stood there with his hands at his sides, while Faye and Wilder walked the young soldier back from the edge. When the gurney finally moved toward the surgical suite, Goss touched Faye's arm. "You and I," he said, "are going to have a conversation." The conversation happened in the scrub room. Goss positioned himself between Faye and the door, which might have been a power move if she hadn't immediately clocked it and gone to the sink instead, turning the water on. She stripped her gloves, She began washing her hands with the methodical, economical motions of someone who had learned long ago that movement could be a form of armor. "You want to explain to me," Goss said. "What kind of nurse thinks she can override a direct order from the Director of Medical Operations?" "The kind that's been doing this for 12 years, Faye said. 12 years of what? Rotating contracts?" He made a small, dismissive sound. "You people come and go. You don't understand the structure of what we're building here." Faye dried her hands. She turned around and leaned against the sink with her arms crossed. She studied him the way she had learned to study terrain, quickly, without expression, cataloging everything. "You've never been downrange," she said. It wasn't a question. Goss blinked. "I beg your ribbons." She didn't look at his chest. She'd already looked when he walked in. Army service, national defense, global war on terrorism service. That's the one you get for being in uniform during wartime, not for actually deploying. Meritorious Service Medal, which is genuinely respectable, usually awarded for doing something well in garrison. No combat medical badge. No deployment patch on the right shoulder. She tilted her head slightly. "You've spent your career in buildings with air conditioning and a functioning commissary, which is an honorable way to serve. But it is not the same as knowing what it looks like when a man's lung is collapsing and there is no backup coming." The color in Goss's face was doing complicated things. "You are about 10 seconds away from the end of your time in this hospital," he said. "You keep saying things like that," Faye replied, "and the patient keeps not dying. It makes it hard to take the threat seriously." Goss stepped closer. He was tall and he used it. "What is your rank, nurse?" "In this building, you are at the absolute bottom of the hierarchy. You have no commission, no standing, no authority of any kind. So I'm asking you plainly, what are you? Because from where I stand, you're nobody." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she uncrossed her arms. She reached for the hem of her right sleeve and began to roll it up. Slowly, past her elbow, up toward the bicep. She turned her forearm over, inner wrist facing the harsh fluorescent light, and held it toward him. The tattoo was not large. It was faded at the edges the way tattoos fade on skin that has seen weather, sun, and things that don't wash off in a shower. It was a caduceus, 2 snakes, a winged staff, but it wasn't a standard medical caduceus. The wings spread over a small parachute canopy, and beneath the whole image, in clean block letters, was a designation, 18D, SFMS. Below that, a small unmistakable patch, the arrowhead crest of United States Army Special Forces. Goss stared at it. 18D, Special Forces Medical Sergeant, not a field medic, not a combat lifesaver. One of the most intensively trained battlefield surgeons the United States Army produced. A 12-month qualification course that most candidates washed out of, followed by years of deployments to places the Army didn't mention in press releases. These were the operators who performed emergency surgery under active fire, who kept generals alive in valleys where no evacuation helicopter could safely land, who made decisions in 30 seconds that trauma surgeons in sterile hospitals debated over for hours. His eyes traveled from the tattoo to her face. "That's," he started. "Yes," she said. "You're a civilian." "I am now." She rolled the sleeve back down, smoothed the fabric flat. "I retired at E7, Sergeant First Class. 4 deployments. 2 in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq, 1 in a location that doesn't have an official name in any document you are cleared to read." She dropped her paper towel into the bin. "I got tired of the politics. I just wanted to keep working." She picked up her discarded gloves. "Now, Director," she said quietly, "are you going to write that report?" Goss didn't write the report, not in the scrub room anyway. He went to his office and he spent 40 minutes trying to find a reason not to be afraid. He pulled her file in the personnel system. It loaded partially, then threw up a red bordered restricted access banner he had never seen on a civilian employee file before. The visible text said, "Honorably discharged. Rank E7, and then 7.5 pages of solid black redaction. He called a general he knew at Medcom. The general said, "Warren, I'm going to tell you this once. Walk away." Then hung up. He called a Pentagon contact who owed him a favor. The contact said, quietly and without elaboration, "Do you understand why she's at Brooke right now? Because the Army Surgeon General personally requested she consult on combat trauma protocols. She asked to do it in scrubs because she doesn't want the brass." A pause that lasted slightly too long. "I would leave it alone." Goss sat in his chair for a long time after that, looking at a framed photograph of himself at a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new hospital wing. It had felt like an achievement when it was taken. He wasn't entirely sure how it felt now. He found out whose son was in Bay 4 at 1400 hours. The dog tags had been obscured by blood and trauma response. When the surgical team finally ran the ID verification, the name that came back hit the floor supervisor like a physical blow and traveled upward through 3 levels of hospital administration in approximately 12 minutes. Corporal Jesse Lorne, son of General Frank Lorne, Commanding General of the United States Army Medical Command, and the man whose signature was on the funding authorization for the exact consultation program that had brought Faye Ryker to Brooke Army Medical Center in the first place. Goss was still in his office when he heard the rotors. General Frank Lorne did not look the way generals look in photographs. In person, he was leaner, quieter, and much more frightening. He came down the corridor of the surgical floor, with 2 aides clearly working to keep up, and a face that gave absolutely nothing away. He did not stop at the nurse's station. He went directly to the ICU suite. Dr. Wilder was waiting in the hallway, and he gave the general the report in full, without embellishment. The timeline, the decompression, the pressure that had been hauled back from the edge in Bay 3 before they ever reached the oar. When Lorne asked who had guided the intervention, Wilder didn't hesitate. "The civilian trauma nurse," he said. "Ryker. She kept me from losing him in the first 10 minutes. Lorne said nothing. He turned toward the corridor. Faye was coming around the corner carrying a medication tray, in the same faded scrubs she'd worn all day, hair in the same bun, moving with the same quiet efficiency she had brought to every hour of her shift. She stopped when she saw the general. General Frank Lorne brought his hand up in a clean, sharp, unambiguous salute. The corridor went completely still. The aides, a nurse at the station, Wilder, and Director Goss, who had materialized at the edge of the hallway like a man watching an execution he knew was partly his own, all stopped moving at once. Faye stood there for a half-second. Something passed across her face, recognition. And beneath it, the careful stillness of a person who has spent years keeping certain rooms inside themselves locked. Then she raised her hand and returned the salute. Crisp, automatic, absolutely certain. "Sergeant Ryker," Lorne said. His voice was controlled but only just. "My son is alive because of you." "He's a fighter, General," she said. "Dr. Wilder did the work." Wilder tells it differently. He let a moment sit. "I was at a forward operating base in Kunar Province when your after action from Patrol Base Kearney crossed my desk. March 2017. I've read every page of it, the classified version, not the sanitized one. His jaw worked. There are no words adequate to what I owe you. There's no debt, Faye said quietly. That's not how this works. Lorne nodded once, the nod of a man who has heard that particular answer before and knows better than to argue with it. Then he turned, and his eyes found Goss. The hallway, which had been silent, somehow went quieter still. Director Goss, Lorne said, I reviewed the security footage from Trauma Bay 3 on my way in. I watched you attempt to remove Sergeant Ryker from my son's side while he was in hemorrhagic shock. He paused, and the pause was very deliberate. I also pulled the phone records from your office for the past 3 hours. Goss opened his mouth. The time for talking was before you made those calls, Lorne said. Close it. He looked at Goss for a long, flat moment, not with rage, but with the specific cold finality of a man making an administrative determination. You are relieved of command of this facility, effective immediately. Reassignment orders will reach you by 0900 tomorrow. I suggest you use the remainder of today to make your personal arrangements. Goss looked around the hallway. He found no ally in any face he encountered. He looked at Faye last. She was watching him with those gray eyes. There was no triumph in them, no satisfaction. He was simply a problem that had been resolved, a vital sign that had returned to within normal limits. He walked to the elevator. The doors closed behind him. 3 days later, Faye sat in the break room at the end of a double shift, holding a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold without her noticing. She was thinking about Kunar Province, as she occasionally did in quiet moments, about the particular quality of the light there before the heat took over, about sounds she had spent years learning to file away in places she didn't have to visit often. Wilder knocked on the doorframe. He looked better than he had at 0647 2 mornings ago. Steadyr in himself, somehow. The way people sometimes look after they've come through something frightening and discovered they could still function on the other side of it. He's asking for you, Wilder said. Jess Lorne. He's been awake for a few hours. He asked if you were on shift. Faye went down to the ICU. Jessie Lorne was propped against the pillows, pale and bandaged, and young in the particular way people look young in hospital beds, stripped of everything that usually makes them seem older. He had his father's eyes, sharp and assessing, not missing much. You're the one who kept me in the room, he said. It wasn't a question. Dr. Wilder. Don't do that, he said, not unkindly. My dad told me everything. He looked at her arm. He told me about the tattoo too, about Kearney. Faye sat down in the chair beside the bed. My dad mentions that operation sometimes. Jessie said, quieter now, when he thinks we're not paying attention. About the medic, who held a breech alone for over 20 minutes with a sidearm, while keeping a captain's airway open by hand in the middle of a mortar barrage. He shook his head slowly. We thought he was exaggerating. The way he told it, it sounded like something someone invented to motivate recruits. Most true things sound that way, Faye said. Is it true? She looked at her hands. They were still as they always were. The part I remember, she said, is that the captain lived. The rest of it is just the job that needed doing. Jessie was quiet for a moment, looking at the window. Then, I want to go SOCM when I get out of here. I know I'm infantry. I know it's a long shot. But after this week, I can't imagine wanting to do anything else. Faye looked at him for a long time. Study your anatomy, she said finally. All of it, even the parts the instructors tell you to skip. She stood and smoothed the front of her scrubs, And get out of my ICU, Corporal. That's an order. He laughed. It pulled at his stitches and he winced hard, but he kept laughing. The offer came through official channels a week later, delivered by Dr. Hannah Greer, the new chief of medical operations, a trauma surgeon who had done 2 overseas rotations and kept her own set of scrubs in her office closet rather than on a hanger. The document restructured Faye's position entirely. Lead trauma coordinator, with full authority over Bay-level triage decisions, protocol design, and staff certification standards. No administrative duties, no assigned desk hours, no dress code beyond clinical scrubs. Faye read the document twice. She set it on the table between them. I keep my own schedule, she said. Done, said Greer. And I pick my own team. Within budget. Then, yes, Faye pushed the document back across the table. Tell whoever needs to know. She went back to the floor. That evening, washing her hands at the end of her shift, she caught the reflection of her own forearm in the steel surface above the sink. The tattoo was barely visible in the dim fluorescent light. The caduceus, the canopy, the designation that meant something to very few people still living. She looked at it for a moment without particular emotion. It was not a trophy. It was not a weapon. It was a record of a promise made in a very different place, in very different light. That as long as she had hands and a steady pulse, no one in front of her would die, because she was too frightened or too small or too tired to act. The overhead paging system crackled to life. Code red Trauma Bay 2, incoming medevac, critical surgical, ETA 4 minutes, all available surgical staff to the bay. Faye turned off the water. She dried her hands. She rolled both sleeves down and walked toward the alarms the same way she always had. Without hesitation, without fanfare, toward exactly the place she was always meant to be.